All right, a very good evening. And at the very outset, let me greet all the participants. Many wishes and greetings of Makar Sankranti, Uttarayan, Lori, Pongal, Bihu. On behalf of the Alumni Association of Department of English, I welcome Mr. Rohal Rawal, the speaker for today, who will be speaking on the topic Marxism. Um, Mr. Rohal Rawal is an alumnus of the Department of English, Saurashtra University, and he's currently a teaching assistant at Bhakta Kavi Narsimha Mehta University, Junagadh, Gujarat, from where he is also pursuing his doctoral studies. He has cleared both NET and GSET examinations. He is one of the keen, rational, and intellectual brains, thinking brains that I have come across in the field of literary theory and criticism. And discussions with him are always an intellectual treat. Rohalji, welcome on behalf of Alumni Association, and let us begin the topic Marxism and Marxist literary criticism. Over to you, Rohal.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you very much for the kind and lovely and generous introduction. Respected faculty members from Department of English and CLS, Saurashtra University, Rajkot, from other faculty members from across Gujarat and beyond Gujarat, fellow research scholars and dear students. A very good evening to one and all. The topic today is Marxism and Marxist literary criticism. Uh, Let me turn on screen sharing so I can share the PPT. Is the PPT visible?
Yes,
Okay.
you can turn on the slideshow.
All right. Yes.
Yes, visible now.
The topic, as it says, Marxism and Marxist literary criticism. Now, first of all, we need to have a simple understanding of these two terms, what we mean by them. Marxism obviously refers to the economic, political, and philosophical ideas of the German philosophers Karl Marx and his frequent collaborator Friedrich Engels. And when we analyze, read, interpret, and evaluate literature based on the economic and political ideas of these two philosophers, that we can refer to as Marxist literary criticism. Now, obviously, Marxism is one subject or one topic that we usually study even in our high school from our 9th or 10th standard social sciences. So we usually have some idea or some notion that Marx and Engels are concerned with the capitalist industrialized society of the mid 19th century. But why are they so much concerned or devoting so much of their time and energy to analyze and understand this capitalist industrialized society? The answer to this question is obviously implicit in almost each and every of the work that either Marx writes on his own or in collaboration with Engels. But a clear enunciation of this idea or the reason we find in a contribution to the critique of political economy, first published in 1859, where Marx formulates his base and superstructure hypothesis or idea. The reason Marx and Engels devote so much of their time to understand this mid 19th century capitalist and industrialized society is that they find that everything in this society is determined by economy, is determined by money, is controlled by capital. So by the term base, they mean economy or capital or money. And it is out of this base that they say a superstructure arises, or the base makes possible each and every kind of superstructure. So for example, if you want to start a school, a very noble initiative, but in order to start a school, you would first of all need some land. In order to acquire that land, you will obviously have to pay some money to the seller of the land. Now, once you buy the land, you will have to construct a building. So it again requires material and manpower. Those material and manpower does not come free, but you have to pay for them as well. Once the building is constructed and the students start coming in, students cannot be permitted to sit in the class because you have invested so much of your money free of cost. The students would be paying certain amount of fee. So again, money or economy comes in. The teachers who are teaching, they share their knowledge and everything because they are being paid. Everything, in short, is controlled by, determined by money, economy, or capital, which Marx calls the base. And everything becomes possible because of this base, which he terms as the superstructure. Now, when he analyzes the base, he finds that there are usually two groups that form. One group who controls almost everything related to production, the means of production, those sources and resources by which anything can be produced. There is this one group who controls money, who has lots of money, lots of wealth, the group who has much land power with them, the group who controls machinery and owns factories, which we label or term as the bourgeois or the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production, land, factories, capital, etc. And on the other side, Marx says, are the working class people who do not own anything, who work for the bourgeoisie, the working class or the proletariat in factories, mines, or whatever the work they might be doing at different places. So these two classes, he says, are found in the capitalist society. And it is not that only in capitalist societies these two classes emerge, but rather Marx makes a very interesting statement in the Communist Manifesto, is that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. So any way you would look up at history, you would always find two classes of people opposing each other or fighting against each other, because one class owns something or many things and the other class has nothing. So in earlier times, for example, we had kings and the slaves, where the slaves had nothing and the kings had everything. From there, perhaps we move on and we come to the king and the queens and the peasant relationships, where the kings or the monarchy levies taxes on the peasants, and the peasants who are facing agrarian distress and drought and everything, and they revolt because they have nothing to eat, they have no money or food to pay in taxes. So the French Revolution is obviously what I'm referring to. And when industrialization picks up, when industries are established in large numbers, factories are established in large numbers, then these two classes come in. One who owns the land and the factories, and obviously the profit and everything that they make from it. And on the other hand, there is the working class. So it is a struggle, Marx says, between the haves and the have-nots. One class has everything and the other has nothing. So, because everything in society is determined and controlled by money, Marx and Engels devote so much of their time and energy to understand this society and to uh, reason or to try to understand if a kind of a change is possible, or a change, whether a change can occur in such a environment or such a situation. The relations of production, obviously, that exist between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat is that of operation and exploitation. The factory owners would be paying very less money as wages to the working people, to the laborers, compared to what they should be paid for their labor. The laborers themselves do not have access to the products that they manufacture. The product goes out into the market, it is sold, the factory owner earns a lot of profit because the wage that is paid to the laborer is quite less compared to what the production cost is, and they even sell it at higher price compared to the production cost. So from both sides, by selling the product as well as by paying the laborer few wages or comparatively less wages than what they deserve, they earn profit. And Marx's vision is this dialectical materialism, where he believes that the material conditions that exist in society, in the capitalist society, ultimately lead to a conflict or will lead to conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And that is why in the Communist Manifesto, he requests or makes a clarion call to the proletarians to unite, to come out into a revolution, to overthrow the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production. And based on this, we can say that three major reasons emerge out why Marx and Engels are so very much against capitalism and capitalist societies. The first is obviously, as we discussed, the relationship of operation and exploitation between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, where one class governs and controls and enjoys everything, and the other has nothing, even not the basic facilities or amenities of life by which they can live a life of dignity. That is food, shelter, and clothing. They struggle even there also. So, one is this relation of exploitation and operation. The second point is obviously capitalism values everything based on these three values: use value, exchange value, and surplus value, to which a fourth one we can add sign value. What are these three values? The first is the use value, how I can make use of something or somebody, how something or somebody can be of use to me. If I'm a factory owner, I employ a laborer and I make them work for 8 hours in a day. And if the standard wage that government or anyone who decides that should be $10 per hour or 2 hours, I would be paying them $2, $5 per hour. So I exploit their labor and in turn I pay them less. So how this labor or these laborers can be of use to me. Exchange value. If I give something to somebody, what can I gain back in return? So if I have X quintal of wheat, I can exchange those quintal of wheat for Y liters of milk, for Z grams of dal, etc. If I am giving up something, what do I gain in return? So if I have a laborer in my factory who is injured, whose hand is perhaps broken or fractured, who cannot work for maybe a month or 2 months, instead of helping him out or waiting for him to recover, what I would do is I would fire him because he is of no value to me or little value to me, and I will hire someone who is more able and able to devote time to the manufacturing. So by firing away this laborer who is injured and in exchanging him or her in return for one healthy, I am trying to maximize or maintain my profit, that is the surplus value. Is that if I make any product that has cost me $50, I would try to sell that product at a price of $60 or $70. Now, out of those $70 that I earn, obviously I would not be paying the laborer an equal amount. I would be paying the laborer quite few, out of 70, maybe $10, $5. So my profit is so high, surplus, whatever remains more. So capitalist society favor only these values. How something can be of use to me, how if I give up something, I gain something more in return, and how can I increase or maximize my profits. And finally, the fourth one is the sign value, where emotional attachments do not come in, but only products, how much they are able to raise the prestige of someone. This is how they are valued on rather than on any emotional attachment with them. If you have seen the film Three Idiots, there you find a character by the name called Suhas Tandon. Now he values everything based on how costly it is. Suppose if I have a watch which has been gifted to me by my father, which was in turn gifted to him by his grandfather, by his father, and this is how generation to generation it is following in our family. It is of no value. But if there is a very famous brand, who sells new watches, $10,000, $20,000. I would prefer that because everyone in society likes those brands and everyone wears watches from those brands. I would value that rather than the one which is in my family from centuries or maybe ages. So capitalist people value everything based on these brands and what sign or stature or prestige is associated with them. And finally, the workers who manufacture the products, they themselves are alienated from it. They themselves cannot make use of them because they cannot afford the price at which the product is being sold. So these three can be cited as the major reasons why Marx and Engels are so much against capitalism. That one class owns everything and exploits the another for its labor power. They are always looking for maximizing their profit without the care and concern for the people who make or manufacture the products, that is, the laborers. And finally, the laborers who manufacture them, they themselves are denied the possibility of accessing them or making use of them. And that is why, at the end of the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels, they say, they request, they make a clarion call to the proletariat, to the working class people all over the world, not just from Germany because they belong to Germany, but proletarians across the world, is that you have nothing to lose but your chains. You have nothing to lose or come out of but oppression. So you rise, you come together, you unite and overthrow this unjust, exploitative owners of the means of production, this bourgeoisie people who come out in revolution. These are the three major works, either by Marx on his own or in collaboration with Engels. The German ideology, first written in 1846, but gets published much later in 1932. The Communist Manifesto or Manifesto of the Communist Party in 1848, and Das Kapital, in which Marx discusses these three values, which in English is known as Capital, a Critique of Political Economy, published in three volumes, the first one in 1867, and the second two after Marx's death posthumously by the corrections and additions made by Engels. And Marx says that capitalism itself sows the seeds of its own destruction because the bourgeoisie will keep on exploiting the laborers for their labor power. When machine production comes in, when mechanized production comes in, which produces goods in large numbers, the value of labor power will go down. You can pay laborers less and less because machines can manufacture more quickly than what laborers can. So your profit can increase, your costs or the wages that you pay to the laborers can go down. But it also sows the seeds of its own destruction because one, the laborers are being exploited, paid less and less. Machine production is very fast, mechanized production is very fast, but it also floods the market with goods at quite a rapid pace, overproduction, and on the other side you have less consumption. So it also creates or might create problem. And Marx believes that there will come a time when the proletarians of the world will unite, will overthrow this unjust system. There is a workers' revolution that will take place against the bourgeoisie. And what will be established will be a socialist society. Socialist society in the sense that there will be a government which will look after the basic necessities of each and every individual. The basic being food, shelter, and clothing. And from socialism, Marx and Engels say the movement will be towards communism, where even the need of a supervising government will not be there, but there will be a community of people staying together, looking after each other, helping each other. I help somebody who is in need, even if I do not know him or her, even if I am not related to him or her community. a classless, propertyless society, where class distinctions are eradicated, where no one is rich, where no one is poor, but every person works according to his or her own ability. I work or I do what I am best at. Somebody else does what he or she is best at, and that is how you contribute to the development of society. And in return, they would be given their basic necessities or requirements. So it will be a classless, equalized, or equal society, the same aim as that of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity, which we can call obviously the first Marxist revolution before Marx. And private property will be abolished. There will be no private property. Everything belongs to the society or the community. And Marxists are obviously known as leftists. The reason is that it comes from the French Revolution. When the French Revolution took place, the supporters of the revolution were sitting on the left hand side of the president in the assembly, and the supporters of the king or the monarchy were sitting on the right hand side. So the supporters of the revolution came to be known as leftists. And because Marx and Engels' vision is also similar, that there will come a time when the proletariat will revolt against the bourgeoisie. They also believe in a kind of a similar revolution as that of the French Revolution. The Marxists are also known as the leftists. Based on this, we can obviously say that Marx's vision of society is both materialistic and deterministic. Materialistic because they see material conditions determining the fate of society. One class owns everything, the other has nothing, is continuously exploited and oppressed. And there will come a time when they will revolt. The material conditions that exist make this situation possible. And deterministic also, because both are very sure that a revolution will occur. So it is predetermined that capitalism will ultimately end in its demise because of this workers' revolution. So that they are both focusing on the material condition of society, and they are deterministic also. Now, obviously, as I said, that what is the role of uh, Marxism in the evaluation or interpretation of literature? Obviously, we try to apply the ideas propounded by Marx and Engels to the literary work or the text that we are reading. I have tried to take an example from Gujarati literature, Sundaram's poem Ramne Mandir Zalar Baje, also known as Tran Padoshi, which has been translated into English by Ramanathan and Kothari as Three Neighbors. Now, what is the poem about? The poem talks about three neighbors living on a street, on the same street. One is Ram, the god Ram, in his temple. The other is the very wealthy Sheth, the leader or the money holder of the village, zamindar, what we might call in Hindi. And the other is this Makorbai, a very old, widowed, poor woman who has nothing but her children. She works for the Sheth. She grounds dal for the Sheth because the next day is this Janmashtami, and the Sheth is going to prepare some feast to offer to the god. And Makor is being given a dal or some dal to grind to prepare dishes and delicacies and everything. And very what does Sundaram write? Galina ko gandha ka khuna mare Makor na mahel ubhala jara. He compares the hut or the dilapidated house that Makor is living in with a palace, a very sarcastic or ironical use of language or word. He is using the word palace for the hut or the dilapidated house. He is criticizing the economic imbalance in society, where the Sheikh has everything, fruits and ghees and everything flow in his home. There is no shortage. And on the other side, you have Makor, who grinds dal on a hungry stomach. She has maybe not eaten for 2 days, 3 days, who knows. And she has to work. She cannot stop working. Because if she does not grind the dal and give to the Sheth will not give her money with which she would be able to buy some food for her hungry stomach. So this economic indifference, this economic operation, otherwise the Sheth has everything at his disposal. He has the power, or he can feed the entire village for days and days if he wishes, but he does not do it. So this economic imbalance is what uh, Sundaram is pointing finger at or criticizing. So obviously, when we are reading the text, several questions might be posed, that whether the author has tried to portray the class struggle, has tried to show the effect of the class struggle. Obviously, in this case, also we find Sundaram writes, "Dadi jo dal na apere, Sheth damdi na apere, bijo upwas makor ne thai." Okay, if Makor will not grind the dal, if she will not give it to the Sheth by the morning, she will not get any money in return, meager sum of money to buy some food. So this class indifference, obviously, the author is trying to portray or show the reality of this economic imbalance. What is the ideology of the author or the text? The way Sundaram very ironically uses the word palace for Makor's uh, hut or broken down shack is obviously his sympathy lies with Makor. His criticism is directed at people like Sheth who have everything at their disposal but do not come out to help those in need. It is a critique of the capitalist society. And obviously, the two very important levels of society, the rich and the poor, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, obviously find a representation in this text. And do societal forces determine the fate of the individual? Yes. Makor is hungry, has been going hungry for quite a few days. The Sheth has the power and the means to feed her, but he will not unless she works for him, unless she labors for him and gives some production or material production in return. So it is not any emotional attachment with the individual, but how the individual is useful to me, based on which his or her fate gets decided. And obviously, whether the author is talking about collective problems or individual problems, is it some problem related to love, which we, for example, find in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, which obviously, no doubt, is concerned at some level with class divisions and relations, but ultimately it is usually taken as a love story, individual struggles and problems. Or we take romantic poetry, Coleridge complaining that I have grown up in the city and I want my child to grow up in the company of nature. Or Wordsworth talking about the benefits of nature to his sister Dorothy. And these are very individual stands. The poet giving vent to his subjective feelings and emotions and worries. Keats and Shelley writing about or expressing their desire to escape from society. On the one side, is the text presenting individual problems, or is it talking about collective problems? Problems faced by a large population, the proletariat population in society. And finally, uh, whether the protagonist or the narrator in the story is a member of the bourgeoisie or the proletariat. Obviously, here, at least in this poem, the narrator is trying to be detached and trying to sympathize with the proletariat. So he is trying, or Sundaram is trying to become a member of the proletariat, trying to bring awareness in his readers about this imbalance and injustice that exists in society. And what is the benefit of writing such a poem, or writing such a text? The benefit is obviously what Marx and Engels hope for, that by reading this text, by becoming aware of this exploitation of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie, the reading public, the literate people, will either come out in revolt or inspire a revolt or be inspired to bring about some legislative change or some kind of change in society. And that is why one critic by the name of Granville Hicks, in his article of February 1933 in the journal New Masses titled The Crisis in Criticism, he gives certain requirements that if the work addresses these 3 or 4 points, then it can be considered a Marxist work. The first is obviously that the proletarian reader should recognize his or her role in the class struggle. You should be able to make people like Mako realize that they are being exploited, they are being oppressed by people like this shade. Obviously, the question would be that people like Makor may be illiterate, they cannot read or write. So it becomes the duty of the literate reader to inform them, to raise awareness among them, to lead this proletarian figures to the awareness that they are being exploited. Show the effects of the class struggle. Obviously, here we see that Makor is hungry, hasn't eaten anything for days on end, and then also she has to labor, grind the dal. It is as if she herself is the dal who is being grounded. And the author must be able to feel, make the reader feel that he is participating in the lives described, as if the reader is sympathizing with the condition of Makor, growing sympathy. And the author must come across as the protector or the leader of the proletariat. Here, Sundaram also comes across as the leader of the proletariat, who tries to bring about an awareness in his reading public about this imbalance and injustice, exploitation, and operation. Apart from this class imbalance, where one class is the haves and the other have nots, Marx and Engels are also very much concerned with ideology in their work, The German Ideology, first written in 1846. Now, what do they mean by ideology? Ideology they define as the dominant ideas that any particular society holds, the beliefs or assumptions that a particular society holds. And Marx is very much interested, or both are very much interested in the ideas of the ruling class, the class who governs the society. What are their views? What are their ideas? Because those ideas, those views remain dominant. So those who would be in power, those who would be the authorities, they would, for example, decide this is the food that should be eaten, this is the food that should not be consumed. These are the kinds of clothes that should be worn, these are the kinds of clothes that shouldn't be worn. These are the rights that women should have, voting rights or rights of abortion. And these are the kinds of rights that women should not be granted. It is the ruling class who determines what will happen in society. So, what are the ideas or the beliefs of the ruling class? Because it governs or determines the fate of the society as well as the fate of the individual. And one of the very recent example of this ideology, beliefs in work of the ruling class, we find in the entire incident where a black man by the name of George Floyd was killed during a protest when a white police officer kneels on his neck, puts his knee on his neck for 7 or 8 straight minutes, and the man is not able to breathe. He is repeatedly screaming, "Mama, Mama, please take the, let me breathe." And the officer, the white officer, is kneeling on his neck, and the man dies. And after this, a lot of protests break out, and the vice president of America is asked to comment that a white police officer deliberately kills a black man. Do not black lives matter? Do black lives matter or not? This question is repeatedly posed to the vice president, and the vice president keeps on repeating, all lives matter, all lives matter. He does not say black lives matter, as if he is denying the very existence of black people, as if he is denying the very oppression or exploitation or racism that African Americans have faced for centuries. So this is perhaps the ideology of the ruling class. This is perhaps the ideology of the American vice president, that black lives do not matter or black people do not matter. So if the authority believes so, If the vice president believes so, these ideas will obviously be taken up by many of their supporters, by many of their followers, and they might also perpetuate or continue this chain of operation. That is why Marx and Engels are so much concerned with what is the idea or the ideas that the ruling class believes in. Obviously, the other sections of society who were protesting for the rights of the black people, their ideology was different from that of the vice president. Because for them, black lives, those very lives who have been repeatedly made scapegoats, who have repeatedly been harassed, racism has been directed at them, those lives matter. So it is a contest between two ideologies, and Marx says, and Marx and Engels both say, that it is in most cases the ideology of the ruling class that wins, because it has every kind of power or resources to force it down people's throat. Finally, Marx is also very much concerned with alienation, especially in his economic and philosophical manuscripts on the Paris manuscripts of 1844. What is alienation? Alienation is when the worker feels detached or separated from the product of his own labor. If a laborer is working in a plant that manufactures mobile phones, for example, Apple, the worker cannot afford those very phones that he or she is manufacturing. So he is alienated from the very products that he manufactures. Second, suppose before the rise of industries and industrialism, a cobbler might have the freedom to decide the shape and the size and design of the shoe that he intends to make. So he has a craft with him, an active craft that he is practicing. But with the rise of industrialism and mechanical production, it is an assembly line production where the machine manufactures most of the parts and assembles it. The worker becomes useless and the laborer becomes useless. He is now no longer an artist, but a worker or a laborer, where earlier he used to himself design and manufacture and shape products. Here it is the machine that does everything. So the craft that he or she possess or possessed or possesses becomes useless. It is the machine who makes everything. The product that might be manufactured, he or she cannot access them or make use of them. So the laborer feels disconnected or separated or removed or cut off from his craft or his ability also, and from the ultimate product that has been manufactured. And both of these, again, whether it is ideology or whether it is the effect or outcome of alienation, we can apply or read in one or the other literary works. We have, for example, the novel Lord of the Flies by William Golding, where each of the character can be taken as a symbolic representation of several things, several aspects or several concepts. The two central characters, Ralph and Jack, similarly can be taken as a conflict between two ideologies. On the one side is Ralph, and on the other side is Jack. These are kids stranded on an island, waiting to be rescued. But Ralph believes in democracy. He believes in giving everyone a chance to speak. The conch shell that Ralph and Piggy discover, Ralph says that anyone who has the conch shell in his or her hand should have the right to speak, can speak, and the others will calmly listen what he or she has to say. So it is a very democratic process that Ralph tries to establish on the island, giving everyone a chance to share their views, opinions, and speak. And ultimately, as the leader, he says that only I can interrupt. So he will ultimately decide what should be done or what should not be done, but at least everyone has the right to share their opinions. But on the other hand, you have Jack, who is very autocratic, who wants everyone to follow his dictates. These two ideologies represent the two countries who are warring at the time. On the one side, we have the allies, or the United States and United Kingdom, which believe in democracy and giving everyone their due, or and the right to share their views and opinions. And on the other side, the Jack represents the communist dictatorship. And this is the very irony of Marxism or Marxist revolutions, that uh, the people who start the revolution, initiate the revolution, overthrow the bourgeoisie, one of them obviously would now become the new power, the new central leadership. And that person, himself or herself, starts behaving in very similar manners compared to the bourgeoisie. They transform themselves into a dictator, what Stalin did, for example, in Russia. So even in literary texts, we find two characters who share two different viewpoints, two different ideas of what should be done and how something can be done. Rawls believes in giving everyone their due, listening to everyone and then deciding. And Jack says, no, this is how it will be done. These are the people we will accept, these are the people we will not accept. Piggy, just because he is fat and has a asthma problem, cannot be of much work, cannot be of much use. He immediately says that I don't want you, or we don't need you. Use value. Again, another Marxist concept. Another text where we can find the operations of ideology is the Harry Potter series by the British novelist J.K. Rowling. In the fifth novel of the series, Harry goes to the ministry, just as we have the government which runs everything. In the world of magic that Harry is a part of, they have this ministry of magic which controls and runs everything in the magical world. And he goes to the headquarters of the ministry, where he finds a fountain in the hall or the atrium, which depicts a very tall wizard and other non-human magical species, whether it is a centaur or a goblin or a house elf. These are also magical species. They can also perform magic, but they are not human. They are non-human. And all of these non-human magical species, they are looking up at this wizard and witch human beings with a kind of servitude in their eyes, with a kind of admiration and awe in their eyes. And this perhaps is the belief or the ideology of the magical people, that we being human beings, we are uh, or we should be ruling over, or we can rule over every other non-human magical species. This is something we find in our society or the world that we live in also. That one country or one religion uh, believes is their ideology, their idea, their assumption that we are superior compared to the other race, compared to the other gender, or compared to the other nationality or country, and therefore we ought to or can rule over them. As Marx and Engels says that there will always be more than one ideology in existence in society, one that of the ruling class, the beliefs and opinions of the ruling class, and on the other hand, the of other peoples or other sections of society. Similarly, it is not only the official Ministry of Magic's ideology, which believes that human beings are superior, magical human beings are superior, and so they should be ruling over non-human magical species. But other ideologies also exist. Is that the villain of the series or the antagonist of the series, Lord Voldemort? He believes that only certain people should be permitted to be a part of the magical world. The magical world is divided into two groups basically: the pure bloods, those whose parents both are witches and wizards. So if I am a wizard or a witch, my parent, my father also would be a witch, a wizard, and my mother would also be a witch. So I am a pure blood. But on the other hand, you have half bloods and mud bloods also.
Sir, you have less than 5 minutes remaining.
Okay, okay,
Yeah.
fine. Then we quickly move on to the final aspect, that is alienation. Uh, in Herman Melville's short story Bartleby the Scrivener, a story of Wall Street. This story depicts how the worker feels alienated from his or her own labor. Bartleby is a scrivener working in an office of a lawyer whose job is to note down or copy down legal documents. But just like a proletariat who is very hardworking, Bartleby is also very hardworking initially. He works hard and he does everything properly. But then suddenly one day, he goes to the narrator of the story who runs the firm. And when he asks him to copy down or proofread certain documents, Bartleby says, I would prefer not to. And this is the same response that goes on and on whenever Bartleby is given any task to do. I would prefer not to. I would prefer not to. Why this sudden change? Bartleby, initially when he was hired, he was working so hard. And why this sudden change? He keeps on repeating, I would prefer not to. Is that perhaps the only response possible for a laborer is this conscious revolution or rejection of giving his or her labor for meager wages? Because the work is external to the worker. This copying down of legal documents, proofreading of legal documents does not satisfy emotional needs of the person. Maybe Bartleby wants to be a writer, maybe a poet, but his job is so demanding. From morning to evening, he has to write, copy, and proofread documents to earn money to survive. And that is why initially he is very hardworking. But soon, when this realization perhaps grows in him that the work that he is doing is of no use to him, it does not emotionally fulfill him, it is completely different from what he or she might like to do. He comes up with this kind of a revolution or a response. I would prefer not to. So, what perhaps Melville is trying to say is that in such capitalist societies, the only response should be this conscious denial of being subjected to such unjust oppression and labor. All right. And because we have time limitations, I would not be able to discuss what or how Romantic literature and Marxism can be considered in antinomy with each other or in opposition with each other. Quickly sum up what we discussed, rather. We discussed the three basic uh, uh, points with regards to Marxist theory, that is the base and superstructure model, how everything in society, Marx and Engels believe, is covered, is controlled by the base. We discussed Marx and Engels' views on ideology. We discussed how they expect the working class or the proletariat to overthrow the unjust bourgeoisie, the unjust capitalist system. And we tried to apply their ideas on certain literary texts. All right. I conclude my discussion and am open for questions.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Participants, your questions, suggestions, observations are welcome in the chat box. You can also unmute yourselves and ask. So we have a question from Ananya Mishra, which reads, what is dialectical materialism and how is it different from cultural materialism?
Dialectical materialism is obviously the belief by Marx and Engels that any event that takes place in society happens because of material conditions that exist in that particular society. So dialectic is what we will call in Hindi or Gujarati as vivad. So any event, any fight, any disagreement that takes place in society ultimately arises out of the material conditions that exist in that particular society. And so, what are the material conditions that exist in a capitalist society? It is the conditions where one class possesses everything The haves, the bourgeoisie, they control everything, money, land, capital. And on the other hand, we have the proletariat who do not have everything. So the conflict that arises between these two classes, the dialectic that arises between these two classes, the reason for this conflict or dialectic is the material conditions of this particular society.
Another question is from Ganeshji. How can we rectify the issues of workers? Still, the workers are suffering.
Now, see, the thing is that the question should arise why Marxism failed. The reason is that it is because of a philosophy that demands violent action. A revolution that takes place will be very bloody. The bourgeoisie will be killed as it happened in the French Revolution. So Marxist revolutions will be very bloody, much bloodshed, and not many people would approve of it or like it. The other way to address the problems of workers or the proletariat would be or can be legislation, granting them rights through making laws. That is why we have labor laws and everything in existence. The question that whether they are being diluted or they are being diluted is a different matter. But instead of a revolution, once you read any text which makes you aware of this class and property imbalance, it is rather than going out and participating or creating a revolution, maybe the better response would be to legislate, to convince your lawmakers to try to change this through legislations.
There's a question from Nitin Pitaria. Can we say Marxism is an idealist theory? Because we also find the communist society believing in materialism. And also, the second part of the question is if you could throw some light on the philosophy of Gita in the, I think he means Bhagavad Gita, in the formulation of Communist Manifesto and the other works, if you have come across them.
The first part I would very much agree with him is that yes, it is very idealistic because it believes that one a revolution will take place, and after this revolution, a society which has no class divisions and distinctions will be established. So it is idealistic, no doubt. But in order to establish this idealistic society, what is the path forward? The first thing that comes is this revolution, this violence, this bloodshed. So the path to this change ultimately begins with bloodshed and violence. So maybe, as I said, people would not approve, not many people might approve of this. And the belief that after the revolution, no such injustice will start again. What is the guarantee? The leader or the leaders who emerge out of this revolution, because every revolution ultimately structures around one or the other leader. So anyone who emerges out of it, what is the guarantee that they will not start indulging in the same practices or oppressions which against which the revolution took place in the first place? So it is very idealistic and cannot, the success cannot be guaranteed. As far as the relationship or the inspiration from Gita is concerned, I would very much hope and wish that Parth would take up this question rather than me answering it.
I am really not aware of this thing, whether Marx had read Indian scriptures or not.
The same is with me. Even
It seems he had not read because the basic premises uh, on which these philosophies are based seem to be totally divergent. On one hand, you have Gita, which is uh, a sort of summary of what the Upanishads say. So the Upanishads would say that ma grudha kasyas viddanam tena tyaktena punjita, for example. So and then the entire wealth and shong, the worldview of Marxist theory and Indian philosophy, or Marxist philosophy and Indian philosophy, seems to be deviant to me. So I'm curious, Nitin bhai, if Marx had read Indian scriptures. At present, uh, difficult to say something very authoritatively. Ananya Mishra, sorry, Anay Bhatt, What are your personal views on Marx and ideology? Because he might be right and relevant to a great extent, but not practical. It's more of an ideal state ideology.
Yes, as you yourself mentioned, not practical. But the thing is that ultimately Marx becomes the inspiration or the foundation for philosophers who emerge in the 20th century, in the later years of the 20th century or the second half of 20th century, that especially Derrida. So, in the base of Derrida's views and arguments and philosophy, Marx is very much at the center. So, no doubt he is not practical. No doubt his views of revolution cannot be put into practice because of all the violence and bloodshed. But ultimately, he also becomes the foundation or the inspiration for later thinkers to bring about a change in society. And the
I think
only
somewhere in the slides, sir, that you could not show because of time constraint, you had mentioned like was post-structuralism
I
Marxism in
hate or
disguise or
Marxism in
something.
disguise, yes.
Yeah, yeah,
The base that Derrida and everyone derive about this binary oppositions and everything, it is ultimately very much Marxist. And the fine difference that should be noted between the two is that Marx and Engels are hoping for a active and violent revolution, and not hoping, but they are very sure that this will happen. And on the other hand, Derrida's arguments are made in such a way that as if they are trying to inspire debates, as if they are trying to inspire discussions, and through these debates and discussions to legislate what I said, to grant rights to the oppressed, but through legislation. So you can always tax the rich people, no? If you feel that they have made unjust money throughout their life from oppressing the proletariat, what was Bernie Sanders' attempt in the 2016 presidential election? This is what he said, that the 1% own everything. And if I become the president, I would tax these people, raise the taxes. So maybe taxation, maybe legislation is the response to the impracticality of this violent revolution.
true. Ananya Mishra asking, is Raymond Williams's ideology of Marxism a variation of the ideology of its forefathers?
Now, Frankfurt School and the later Marxists that come in, again, I would defer the question to Parth rather than me be able to answer it.
No, no,
Yes,
that's
no,
it's your day. Please take it up.
no, no. I would not be able to because even my reading of Raymond Williams is not that in detail. So rather than responding it directly or in a
No,
haphazard.
only thing I can say, Ananya ji, is there are versions of Marxism. So Marxism as propounded. First of all, Marx did not propound Marxism. It would be safe to say. So later on, it becomes an ism, right? So there are versions of Marxism. So you have the neo-Marxists, for example, Frankfurt School and others. So their view about Marxism is entirely different. Uh, to an extent that people say that Marxism was distorted to a great extent by the later Marxists. And if Marx could have risen from his grave and looked at how things were distorted, he must have took back his words. So that is a reality, and also Marx was talking about what is known as a relative autonomy in literature. I think Edmund Wilson has to say something about this as well, Rohal, if I'm not wrong.
Right, right.
Yeah, so Marx was talking about a sort of relative autonomy in art and literature. Now the question is, uh, do we read literature to apply Marxism on it, or is it the other way around? So these are questions one comes across when uh, one reads the neo-Marxists, the Frankfurt School, and others. So I mean, this is my take. One may
But
completely agree or
uh,
disagree. Yes.
As you said, that Wilson also takes up this question of autonomy. He uses this very precise words that literature should not be prescriptive, or it should not be made prescriptive. So you cannot expect writers to always write on social themes and themes of the problems faced by the proletariat and everyone. But then on the other side, it obviously remains that what is Marxism? At least we who are concerned with and are students of literature, we have always taken up Marxism as something to be applied to literature, to read literature in the light of the views that Marx and Engels have talked about. But ultimately, their concern was not literature per se. They were not directly involved with literature. Even Wilson mentions that no doubt Marx and Engels were very much fond of literature. But they were not concerned with making literature as their instrument or their weapon to bring about some or the other change in society. So they were talking about this revolution and everything. Uh, but the point that I argued is that autonomy is, as you said, one thing. Legislation is the answer rather than this revolution and everything.
True. Uh, Nilesh ji asking what would be the way out to the puzzle called haves and have-nots.
Again, I would refer back to the same answer that I mentioned a few minutes back. To legislate, to tax those who have been exploiting this proletariats for centuries and centuries. There has been many times this question has been raised that Amazon's founder Jeff Bezos, now whether Amazon should be destructured, should he or this people like him should be taxed more. So maybe guaranteeing the benefits or the basic necessities, food, shelter, and clothing, can be one of the way out. Legislating, granting them rights, proper wages, wages determined on hourly basis. Then they should not be fired without any reason, without any rhyme or reason. So making rules and implementing them, making sure that they are implemented strictly, is perhaps the way out to address these problems.
Uh, there's a question from Milind Bosamya, and I think this will be our last question for the day. Can we say Marxism is a complete contrast to Varna Vyavastha?
Varna Vyavastha, yes, because those are divisions based on class and what one group is doing or can do. Uh, the final class, the fourth class, is always marginalized, whereas Marx says that it should be a classless society where everyone works according, he says, to his or her ability. Now, obviously, this is in something fruitful, this is in something creative. So, teaching perhaps is one activity, making or planning for a building is also one creative activity, because if you are to teach, you also will need a building to erect. So, maybe engineering is a good activity, teaching is a good activity, and anyone who is good at either of this should do that. But this Varna Vyavastha, where the fourth class is being relegated to very or marginalized to certain unworthy tasks, and those can be taken care of by machines, those can be taken care of by technological means. So it is obviously against Varna Vyavastha, classless society, where everyone is on an equal footing, where everyone is equal.
All right. Ananya ji has, I think we can take this because this will be useful for the students. She's asking if you could suggest some books or criticism papers uh, related to this topic, I believe she means.
The
Some
first
reading
and
material.
yes, sure. The first and the primary resource I would suggest is the essay Marxism and Literature by Edmund Wilson. This is perhaps one essay that would ground you in the fundamentals and the basics of Marxism, and it will also point out to you why Marxism should not be the only theory or the only approach to study literature. And if you study and apply Marxist principles or study literature only from a Marxist perspective, what will you lose? You will lose many things. To give you just a small example, you take up Shakespeare's sonnets. and the first 17 of those sonnets. Now, the first 17 sonnets known as this procreation sonnet. Now, Shakespeare is requesting the young men or the youth that you are very handsome right now. You will grow old. There will come a time when your beauty and handsomeness will disappear. So you should have a child of your own to let the world know or believe that once you were this handsome. And because Shakespeare is addressing a youth, a man, so it also raises some or the other questions about Shakespeare's sexuality or sexual orientation. But in these 17 sonnets, or even later ones, is Shakespeare talking about society? Is he talking about societal problems? Is he talking about the class divisions in society? No. But then, does this make his sonnets valueless? No, because the imagery, for example, that is there, the metaphors or the comparisons that are there, the idea, the familiar idea that has been presented in unfamiliar terms. Because ultimately, all the 17 sonnets have the same argument that you will grow old, it is better that you have a child. But all the 17 still are presented in different manner, in novel or unique manner. So just focusing on this economic terms or the economic problem is not the answer. So Marxism and Literature by Edmund Wilson grounds you in the pure Marxist theory, vulgar or classical Marxism as it is usually called. It also points out to you the errors or the mistakes of why Marxism should not be the only approach to literary study.
True. Uh, I think that that brings us to the end of the session. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rohal sir,
Thank
for
you.
taking us a tour towards Marxism and the application of Marxism onto several literary works. I believe it was an interesting session for all the participants, a lot to learn. And thank you for sparing your time. Thank you all the
Thank you for having me. And thank you for being very good, a very good patient audience. Thank you.
uh, and also before we leave, there's an announcement on 15th.